Luke, you have spent much of the year reporting from Ukraine. And in a recent article, this is from late July, you describe a moment of shelling. You write, "Close shelling always induces a burst of animal fright, but this was different. It's one thing to face an indiscriminate bombardment. It's another to find yourself or believe you have found yourself at the terminus of a warhead's deliberate trajectory. We tend to think of artillery combat as remote and personal, but when you're on the receiving end of a strike, it doesn't feel like that. It feels as intimate and vicious as any other way of killing." The reason this struck me for two reasons. The first reason is that you raise the tension between the remote and the impersonal and the intimate and the vicious. And I think the form of journalism, the form of nonfiction more broadly, exists somewhere on the spectrum of dispassionate dispatch of numbers dead, buildings destroyed, dollars spent on the one hand, and fiction that helps us understand war's cost in terms of minds, souls, and families on the other. Given that you yourself have written fiction in short stories, which explores these costs, how does journalism and nonfiction, what does it do for you that these other forms cannot achieve?
Well, is it on? So Matt and I are very fortunate in the sense that we do long form journalism, and American long form journalism for magazines that allow us to spend much more time with subjects and in places than really any European outlet is able to. And then also to write in more detail than most European outlets allow for. So that genre of journalism resembles fiction, I think, more than the kind of newspaper journalism you were referring to at first, because I think it's fair to say that Matt as well and I really try to focus on individual people and characters and how they're affected by these conflicts that otherwise can seem to readers, in particular Western audiences, as kind of abstract statistics. And also I think there's with the wars that we've covered that have lasted so long, there's a kind of a fatigue that sets in for Western readers and audiences, and just this kind of sense of accumulated horrors adding up to a kind of nebulous zone of tragedy. And it's hard to assign personal suffering and characteristics to those conflicts when they go on for, like, especially Syria, I think, is a pretty good example of that. So that's I think our task, and that's also the task of good fiction, is to personalize some of these conflicts that otherwise can elude people who aren't able to experience them firsthand.
It's a great precision, the form, the particular form of American nonfiction. I'd pose the same question to you, Matthieu.
Well, I think that
I'm just really speaking.
Sure. What's interesting about perhaps the difference between fiction and literary nonfiction is that there is I think, inherently didactic quality to literary nonfiction, or often, at least in terms of the journalism we're trying to do, where you're trying to explain something, you're trying to get something across, a truth about a situation in a way that I don't think is necessary or quite as direct in fiction. And so the transparency, ironically, the transparency of the style becomes a vehicle for quite a lot of information, of a kind of way of bringing your attention to something. So in the example that you cited, it is the visceral experience of war. But one of the things I found very fascinating about Luke's book, which is this amazing, whole narrative of all these demonstrations and tumult leading up to the January 6th insurrection, where he was there, he was in the rotunda, And it's an incredible work of firsthand reporting, but you can read it right through almost like it's a novel. But when you go back and look, there's all these moments where Luke pauses and he reflects, and there's some kind of psychological observation about this moment that becomes a vehicle for examining something larger about, for example, the complicity of journalists in ways, he's feeling guilty about being there in the rotunda. Is he participating in this insurrection? The complicity of the media in portraying, this as a spectacle. And that's like kind of the opposite of naturalistic. That is a very deliberate technique. I think maybe I'm getting you wrong here, Luke, but you go back and you relive and you rework, and you're actually layering in all these levels of didacticism into what seems like a transparently naturalistic style. And I think that is different from fiction.
This is great. You raised 2 points that we're going to come back to, this idea of being complicit and the idea of spectacle. I want to go back to you in the sense that I discovered this article late in the day that you wrote. It's called The Dark Side of Long Form Journalism. And in some ways it answers the question that I first posed to you, because you're thinking about the differences between fiction and, as you say, this long form American journalism. And you ask yourself at the end of the article, so why keep doing it? Why do I still feel instinctively that this work is urgent and necessary? I think it has to do with the notion of a record, you write. I believe that there is some essential purpose and value to adding the lives of individual people to the record, even if the people themselves understand the purpose and value of my work to be something different. And this is different from your fiction.
Well, I mean, the main difference is that in fiction, you're not writing about real people. And what I was referring to in the last part of that is the kind of ethically thorny aspect of the transactional nature of journalism, when especially if you're a Western journalist working in a place that's impoverished or racked by conflict or other crisis. Typically the people that you're talking to expect to gain something from being a subject in your story. And it's not necessarily, I'm not talking about financial recompense or anything immediate and concrete, but oftentimes, oftentimes commanders, of rebel forces, for example, want a change in US policy. Like that's what we saw in Syria, or in Iraq, when I was with Iraqi forces, they wanted, attention because they thought it might lead to more weapons for them, or just support from the US military. And there's a similar dynamic in Ukraine. So what I know, having done this now for about a decade, is that the chances of anything I write actually producing that for them is slim to none. And I try to be transparent about that, but you can just feel in your interaction that they don't believe it. I mean, when you're an American working for a place like the New Yorker or the New York Times, and these places, you're kind of cloaked in this magical power, and you can feel how the people you interact with are alive to that. And so it's, for me, it's always it's difficult if you know that they're engaging in this relationship for different reasons than you are. Yeah.
I mean, I think you are cloaked, as you say, you're aware of this magical power, and yet the violence and the danger that you experience is very real. And I think this was highlighted in this passage from your recent article about Ukraine. And the other thing that jumped out at me in that passage from the article is this idea of the bursts of animal fright. So you just said you've reported for over a decade, you've covered wars in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, you covered the Gilets jaunes protests in France. As Matthieu mentioned, you were in the US Capitol on January 6th. Words that are often associated with war zones, not only people covering them, but everyone in them, in any kind of moment of extremists, are words like numb, detached, mechanical. And after all these years, you you still feel these bursts of animal fright. Do you feel them less strongly now? And then this is a related question, because in The Storm Is Here, your new book, which is as brilliant as Matthieu highlights, you make this lovely distinction between people who, in places where there's violence, is a daily part of life. You write, people become habituated to the violence, but never quite inured. Can you talk about this fine line between habituation and feeling inured?
Well, from my perspective as a journalist, there's a bit of a psychological paradox when you're working in the field, because you have to develop a certain callousness almost in order to be efficient and to work in a manner that's not obstructive, or that doesn't create, more tension and anxiety and problems for the people around you who don't have a choice whether or not to be there, in contrast to yourself. And the last thing you want to do as a journalist is, be in a place like Syria, Afghanistan, and be openly distraught or emotional or whatever, because that's not helpful for anybody, and it's not about you. But at the same time, to do, I think, good long-form journalism, such as we were describing earlier, you have to develop a kind of empathy, and you have to maintain that empathy over years and years. So there's a bit of a contradiction there. And I mean, Matt and I were actually talking about this earlier today, and I'd be interested to hear what you say, because his book is what was described in the New York Times as an act of empathy, and I think rightly so. There's an incredible amount of love and tenderness in your book, and your relationship to Omar, the main character. But I find that just keeping that, over the years, doing this kind of work regularly, and preserving that way of seeing other people, while also, being a kind of clinician in the field, it can be difficult.
Yeah. It's great that you bring up Omar and The Naked Don't Fear the Water, because that's where I wanted to go next, to continue to think about this idea of detachment. So the book opens as you decide to accompany your friend, interpreter Omar, on the smuggler's road from Afghanistan to Europe. You've waited for half a year to begin. The journey begins, has a kind of few false starts. You call them plan A, plan B, plan C, finally plan D, which culminates in a particularly tense moment in the southwest of Afghanistan. You're on your way to Iran when Omar, who talks to somebody who's seen the road ahead and is scared by the tales that have come back from the road ahead, decides to go back to Kabul. And you are really mad. And later, you reflect on this infuriation, and then that in turn makes you reflect on your role in the journey. And this gets to the point that Luke raised about empathy versus detachment. You write, I was treating this trip like another assignment where I was in charge. But if I was just going to follow Omar as a journalist, which was my justification for going undercover, then I had to let him make his own decisions. I knew I had pushed things too far in Nimroz, and that I was losing my professional detachment. Tell us about the erosion of your professional detachment in this book.
Well, that line is written with some irony, because later on, quite soon, I go even further, and I really cross the line and take it upon myself to cross borders alone to get back to Omar after we get separated. And in fact, the running through this book is this tension between being in the role of an observer as a journalist, and being on this trip with my friend where our lives are in each other's hands. And I was trying to ultimately help him and other refugees get where they're going, which meant illegally crossing borders and escaping from the police. And the latter is ultimately what I realized I had to embrace as a human being first. That's why the book was called not an act of empathy, actually an act of love. The difference between empathy and love is perhaps a matter of definition, but to me, it's, empathy is something that we have quite a lot of in journalism, especially in magazines. Whereas love is and there's limits to it, and there's plenty of people I think have pointed out how it is ultimately kind of a passive act. Whereas love, I think, is much more active, and it comes from a shared experience. It comes from perhaps even a political struggle together, and that's where the place I found myself, which is not normally a place that journalists permit themselves to go. And I think that probably helped me get through it. What's interesting about the conflicts we've covered in Afghanistan and Syria, where we cut our teeth, at least the wars, so-called wars on terror, is just how confused and hopeless and muddy they often are, and how little distinction you could make in terms of sometimes between the violence that both sides were inflicting on each other, the cruelty. And so these were very muddied conflicts when you compare them to something perhaps like what Luke's writing about in Ukraine, at least the experience of it right now. I'm reminded of a quote by Robert Capa, who wrote to Martha Gellhorn, I looked up today, and I'm probably paraphrasing it, but he said, in war, you have to love somebody or you have to hate somebody. You have to take a side, otherwise you can't bear what's going on. And I think there's something particularly devastating about the nihilism of covering some of these wars. And perhaps it's easier if you feel like there's one side that is righteous and there's one side that one can hope for. I haven't really experienced that, but I did when it came to traveling with my friend and other refugees trying to get to a safer life.
I'm curious because did some of your frustration, and this gets to another great moment in this wonderful article that I would recommend all of you read, called The Dark Side of Long Form Journalism. Were you frustrated because you also wanted to get the story and that you wanted to write this book, you wanted to tell this story, and Omar was not accommodating what you wanted? So Luke writes in this article, in the field, and this is very honest, and I think it's nice to hear this honesty within this conversation. In the field, we're actively, aggressively seeking to see with our own eyes the reality of war, famine, and disaster. And who isn't at least somewhat gratified when he discovered what he sought, at least somewhat disappointed when he doesn't? Do you agree with that?
I think Luke is pointing out the irony of our position, which is, as writers, at the end of the day, everything that we're doing, experiencing, the relationships that we form are, by their very nature, instrumentalized for our own writing, for our own experience. We can never turn off that inner observer, that inner voice. And I think that is a profound alienation in many ways from your fellow humans. And that's why writers are such notoriously lonely and messed up characters, maybe, but you at the end of the day, you have to return by yourself to the page and re-experience it alone. And everything that you felt, everything that you've done, people you've loved and hated, they've just become instruments for this narrative that you're going to write.
Yeah, I would just say even worse than that would be going to these places and forming relationships with people there and not writing anything and coming back empty-handed. And I think that the writers and the photographers that I know who have suffered burnout and wrestle the most with trauma are people who haven't been able to or haven't had the opportunity, maybe because of the outlets for which they work, to translate their experiences into journalism, into either photography or articles that are shared with the world. Because then you're left, having to justify your having been there in the first place without anything to show for it. Yeah, and I think that weighs on people even more than the ethical quandary that I described there. Yeah.
That's a really interesting point. We might have time to go back to it. I'm looking at the time, so we've got to keep moving ahead because I want to get to the question of ideology, which is really fascinating. But in the book, Matthieu, you go undercover, you describe yourself as Habib, a young Kabuli from a modest background. And this question of disguise, I think, raises the question of proximity. How close can one get to the action? And I want to thank Luke for alerting me to this. It's a debate within war journalism I didn't know existed until you emailed me, which is that of embedded and non-embedded reporting. So embedded journalism, when news reporters are attached to military units in a combat zone. Non-embedded journalism, by contrast, is when they're not attached, I imagine, to military units. Can you tell us about embedded journalism, your experience of it, as well as the arguments for it and against, because there are both sides, and what you think about it, having yourself been an embedded journalist?
Sure. I mean, there are issues with both approaches, and there's a long tradition of embedded journalism, at least in the U.S., going back to Ernie Pyle and World War II, and obviously in Vietnam, and then with the invasion of Iraq, it really the U.S. military kind of formalized the embed process. And I wasn't working at the time, but my understanding is that there were a lot of issues at that time with journalists kind of being co-opted by the public affairs branch of the military and used for their own, informational and psychological operations. Because the disadvantage is that the military can, to a large degree, determine what you have access to and what you don't, and therefore how you represent their operations and activities. But what we're finding now is that even worse than that is not having any embed system, and there hasn't been really any journalistic access to American forces or their local partners for some time now. And that's a direct result of special operations forces basically taking control of all foreign conflicts, or more and more control of them. And they're extremely hostile to journalists, just because it's and Matt's written about this. He's investigated war crimes by special forces in Afghanistan, and they, because of the way that they conduct themselves, which is with impunity, it's a very opaque culture. And then an even bigger problem is that they export that attitude, that hostility to transparency and to the press, to the local forces that they sponsor and train, be it in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Ukraine. And that those habits are perpetuated then by local commanders who really determine who hold the real political power in a lot of these countries. And so there's another paradox in which, in places where our military is supposedly intervening to bring democracy to other countries, they're simultaneously, showing an example by their actions of the exact opposite of the kinds of principles that that democracies supposedly represent.
So you would say you would not acknowledge the arguments against embedded journalism, but ultimately you think it's a force for good.
Yeah, you have to have, because otherwise, I mean, this is what we're seeing in Ukraine now. I mean, they've completely shut down journalistic access to frontline units, and we have no idea what's happening on the front lines. And I support Ukraine 100% personally, and I'm open about that. I'm fully biased against Russia, but that it's a problem. Like, journalistic access there is a real problem, and I wouldn't be surprised if if it was the Americans who are actually responsible for that lack of transparency, just because that's what I witnessed in other countries.
What are your thoughts on embedded journalism?
Well, I think embedded journalism can be useful sometimes to militaries. You know, they certainly was for, I think, their powerful tools of propaganda in Afghanistan and Iraq. They helped to maintain public support for the war and maintain a narrative that, whatever narrative was at the time, whether it was that, you know, that the war was over, that there was counterinsurgency now that was going to rebuild the country, that the Afghan military was going to be able to stand up on its own. And so I think when it's useful to governments and militaries, and they're sophisticated enough to make use of it, then they will. And the reason why there's no embed program probably means it's just not useful. I mean, Ukraine obviously doesn't, I don't think, need to mobilize much more Western media support. They have almost complete support across the board. So why do they need to potentially have journalists going in the field and messing things up, right?
But to demonstrate that they're a democracy.
They'll do that later after the war. No, I mean, I think that's a fine abstract principle, but clearly it's not one that's pressing on them. And you know, the way that I look at it, I think that it's a cliche, but the first casualty of war is truth. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. When you have a superpower that is wielding, you know, absolute power of life and death in a state of emergency and military occupation, it creates this powerful force field of untruth, of lies. And there are various ways to attack that, to try to speak truth to power, whether it's going embedded. You know, Luke's done some very fine work embedded from Afghanistan that was absolutely critical of what was going on embedded. But the result, when we don't, I think we aren't critical enough, is that the lie builds and builds and builds, and then it implodes like it did spectacularly last summer in Afghanistan, with devastating consequences for the people there. Because it was a lie. We believed the lie that we've been sold by our governments about that the Taliban were just marginal terrorists, that the Afghan government was a democracy, that it was going to be able to stand on its own feet.
And that also is an argument for embeds, though, I would say, because I mean, 2012, I embedded with the 82nd Airborne in Ghazni, and I was with a unit there that was getting hammered every single day. They were losing guys. They couldn't step outside the wire without without being ambushed. Every single one of the troops at that outpost was very open and explicit about the fact that as soon as they left, the whole district was going to fall back to the Taliban. And at that while I was there on that embed, Obama visited Bagram Air Base and said that the tide had turned against the Taliban and that we were winning the war and it was only a matter of months. And so like that there, like, because I was with the troops, I was able to show, not just claim, but show that this statement by our president was completely false. And when you get, the thing is with embeds is the people who manipulate the system to their own ends or to the ends of their institution are the brass. They're the generals and the colonels and the people who work in the public affairs office. And they're actually working against their own troops, because every single time I've ever done an embed, when you finally get to the unit and you spend time with the grunts and the teenagers and the privates and the riflemen, they all are very, very thrilled to have somebody telling their story and sharing their experiences, and be very honest about the way things are going, which every time, at least in my experience, has been poorly. And that's a strong argument. That's a strong countervailing force to the propaganda being put out by their superiors.
So that was going to be my question: is were you the only embedded journalist? Is it really only kind of one embedded journalist per unit at the time when it was happening? And what did they make of your presence? It seems like they were happy to have.
Yeah, I mean, by then they were already kind of piecemeal decommissioning the embed system, and it was extremely difficult to get to any units that were actually in contact with the Taliban. They would send journalists, to big bases where nothing happened. And so yeah, they hadn't seen any journalists during their year-long deployment.
Okay, I want to talk about Ukraine, and then I want to talk about ideology. So you mentioned Ukraine. It's curious for you that, I mean, I think from your perspective, we're obviously experiencing it differently. I haven't covered it, I haven't been there, but in terms of access, I feel that the war in Ukraine, we've had more access in terms of certainly Zelensky zooming in to US Congress, zooming into universities, zooming into think tanks. We have Ukrainian soldiers posting on Instagram and social media. Obviously, over the course of your career, technology has evolved, and yours too. There's been an influx of new technologies. How does it change how you report and how you see wars being reported? Certainly, it's more visual, surely.
Well, we have access to actually a tremendous amount of visual material without having to go to the front line now, because people are posting. That was, I would say, probably the Syrian conflict that really, where you really saw the inflection point, where citizen journalists, because you had a lot more presence of smartphones and mobile internet, I think, on the front lines of Syria than you did in Afghanistan. Iraq was almost 10 years earlier, and so you could track lot battles in real time, and that was amazing to see. I don't know if in the end it adds up to a more or less accurate picture sometimes. I mean, I feel when I look, we have a tremendous amount of imagery coming from Ukraine, but I don't know really how much it actually represents an accurate picture of what's happening on the front lines. We've seen a lot of these very surprising offensive breakthroughs or reverse situation. It seems like the flow of information that's coming from the front line, and maybe I'm wrong here, Luke, because I'm saying this very much as someone who hasn't done any reporting and is just watching through, my phone or on the computer, is that there's not a good flow of information despite all this technology from the front line.
What do you think?
Well, for my last assignment, which was in the Donbass, I bought a GoPro, which was a huge technological leap for me. And to me, that's I mean, this is kind of a different subject, but
You had your phone around your neck for the January 6th. That was your old,
And you had your phone
manual
GoPro,
just
like everyone else.
Yeah, like everyone else. Yeah, exactly. No, the iPhone's amazing too. I like, and Matt does this as well. And all the long form or literary journalists that I admire do this is they build their narratives around scenes. And to have scenes, at least that are accurate and not, kind of embellish like they did in the old days. You have to record stuff, and especially if you work for the New Yorker, there's a rigorous fact-checking process, and you have to provide substantiating documents and photographs, video for whatever you describe to the fact-checking department. Yeah, for a while I had a dictaphone, and I would just narrate into it everything that was happening around me, and then I would transcribe that afterwards, and then I got an iPhone and started recording stuff. And now with the GoPro, I just have it clipped onto my flak jacket and walk around and record everything happening with a wide angle lens, and it's just an incredible resource to be able to go back to these videos and like freeze frame on certain moments and describe in incredible detail what you witnessed.
What about this question that Matthieu raised of pace and tempo? Because as long-form journalists, you're kind of committed yourself to a slower process of thinking and repurposing, as you say, images and scenes. How does that for you pair or cut with this instantaneous news that we get, live tweets? I mean, you're not on Twitter, you're on Twitter.
Unfortunately. I mean, I think it's true that you're talking to two fairly traditional people here. I mean, Luke's not even on Instagram.
What do the youth say?
He's and so and I am, unfortunately, but so follow me. But I really like the written word. I like books. I don't think there's ultimately going to be anything that's going to displace, the traditional narrative. But that being said, I was in Kabul last summer reporting, and we had, I may remember an airstrike, talk about the gap between what the military says and the truth. We had an airstrike a drone strike where they were like, we eliminated an ISIS terrorist who was about to bomb the airport in his car bomb. And the next morning I went there with my photographer, Jim, and we get there in the morning, the first journalist there, and it's a family house. They've blown up a car inside the courtyard. There's like still body parts there. People are crying their eyes out, and they're showing us photos of little kids. They killed all these little kids. And then the guy's an aid worker, and it turned out to be completely innocent. And I wrote that story that day, and I wasn't the only one, but it was really the video. We gathered video evidence of, not just the area of the courtyard. There was clearly no bomb in the car because the house wasn't damaged enough, but also we got the surveillance camera footage from his office that showed his whole day and him putting these jugs in the trunk of the car that had water for his family because there's no water at home. And that video, I think, really is what forced the military to do a 180 very quickly. They came out, they apologized and said that we killed an innocent man and his family. And that video, and I really was, so that video had an amazing impact that I don't think a piece of writing would have had. And also, I remember seeing people in Kabul, like Afghans, locals, they're watching the video and they couldn't necessarily, maybe they didn't speak much English, but they could see and they could tell what was being said from the video. And it's just, I think especially in terms of broadening our audience, because it tends to be a bit of an elite audience who sits down and reads the New Yorker, not the New York Times, but and so yeah, I think it's good. There's a lot of really interesting experiments happening. I'm thinking of Ben Mock's piece that he did. It just won an Emmy on Uyghur concentration camps in China, where they had all this material, because again, you can't get access. You can't go to China and embed with the Chinese state police to check out their Uyghur re-education camps.
You can't.
So there's ways to. I think there's a lot of interesting experiments happening right now around technology, and perhaps even we will come around and start wearing a GoPro. You should live stream, man.
You can live stream to Matthieu's Facebook or Twitter account.
The dude doing that Occupy, remember?
Okay, good. Let's talk about fringe ideology, because you both encounter fringe ideology, certainly fringe ideology at the American Library in Paris in the 7th arrondissement. I will keep my personal politics out of this. Matthieu, towards the end of your book, you travel to Athens, traveling in particular to an anarchist stronghold, Exarchia, yes?
Yes.
It has all the typical markers of the left, signs saying all cops are bastards. You've seen this in Paris, a cab, no one is illegal. This is Airbnb supporters go home. Here we have class war, collective cafes, a self-managed park, and so on. You spend time at City Plaza, which is an autonomously run squat where activists and refugees live together. You write, the City Plaza project called for open borders, but it wasn't easy to see how that would work. Words like democracy and justice sounded right, but led you in circles when you scaled them up. To the size of the planet. You also write, beneath the surface, free anarchia was coming apart under outside pressure and the weight of its own contradictions. Tell us about the state of the far left and the left as you experienced it in Greece.
Well, I went there at a moment of sort of double crisis, where you had the debt crisis, the austerity crisis, the quite misguided and repressive measures that were undemocratically forced on the Greek people by the Troika, through blackmail, basically. And so you had that, which had mobilized huge sections of the population because people were literally, in some cases, starving. Those malnutrition shot up, the Greek incomes plummeted. And then you had the migration crisis. You had, over the course of a year, 1 million people enter Europe, the Mediterranean, biggest movement of refugees by sea in history. And when the humanitarian corridor that had been opened in the Balkans closed, you had people sleeping on streets. Many of them were families, women and kids. And so that actually mobilized the same solidarity movements, as they call themselves, that had mobilized as a form of mutual aid to provide people with food, with education, with whatever it is that the Greek state had kind of collapsed and failed to provide. they were now helping migrants, and some of them were quite radical. Some of them were ideological. The group that we ended up with, just because my friend and I, Omar and I, needed shelter, we ended in this squat that was a former hotel that had been taken over by a group of No Borders activists. And so it was fascinating to observe this almost utopian experiment that had plenty of problems, let me tell you, up close, but that was nevertheless full of hope and moments of love. And to see it and to know that it sort of existed in a moment, an extraordinary moment. It was a moment of rupture of crisis where all these experiments flower and then they pass. And we kind of go, I think we go through phases, and it's very difficult to know when you're entering this moment of possibility, of revolutionary possibility even at the time. But our job, I think, as writers is to be present and then to record it, and so that tend to preserve it in a sense, so that it exists now when it seems like a very dark time indeed in Europe for many reasons, not least of all are the extremely repressive policies that are now in place at the borders, where refugees are being illegally beaten and thrown back into Turkey, where we're making deals with dictators to keep out migrants. Where you can preserve the memory of that struggle, that moment, and I think that's what we need to do.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm particularly interested in is certainly you preserved a lovely moment in time that you experienced, but this rhetoric, words like, as you say, democracy, justice, that we still hear this today, and people calling for no borders. And as you say, when you delve down into the details, it's not clear how that would actually look. And so my question really is, what can we understand about the left today?
Yeah.
That, you know, the left is often called the fractured left. We're divided. It's not clear, you know, we want to collapse the police, collapse borders, and I found the seeds of some of this rhetoric here, and we still have it today. So it's not a moment in time, it persists.
Well, I think that what I'm referring to is a feeling that many people on the left have, which is one of confusion, which is that we feel that there's not a very clear alternative to the current system. In many ways, the crises that we're undergoing, whether it's, you know, climate change or the war in Ukraine, are reinforcing the very same structures that have gotten us to this point, our militaries, nationalism, and so corporations. So in the face of what seems, you know, very much like a moment of hesitancy, of weakness, of retreat for the left. I mean, look what's happening in Europe now with these elections. You nevertheless have people who are continuing to struggle. You have meaningful action being taken on the ground. And I think I wanted to convey that in kind of plain English, in a way that people who don't necessarily, you know, spend a lot of time reading academic articles about Gramsci or whatever are nevertheless going to understand and feel like they maybe share some of those feelings themselves.
You had a great description of the City Plaza, which is that the people who were going there were looking for truth and they found love. Just nice. Two other kind of buzzwords. You also talk about fringe ideology. I mean, you talk a bit about the left, but you certainly deal with the extreme right and the right. And again, all the kind of traditional markers are there. So this culminates, as Matthieu said, as we said, you're at the storming of the US Capitol on January 6th. So there are Make America Great Again hats, Trump 2020 shirts, a lot of camouflage, many eagles. And yet, some of the rhetoric is the same. You know, these words like justice, freedom are swirling around. You cite Proud Boys who are posting online calling for very similar things. Every cop involved should be executed immediately. I mean, slightly more violent and militaristic, but certainly the impulse might be there. Time to resist and result. Fuck these DC police. I think this pressure between the extreme right and the extreme left collapses in this very particular person called Christian Kulas, who, you write, says, "God is with us," exclaimed a young man with long blonde hair and a Burberry coat. He was Christian Kulas, whose family owned Kulas Maids, a high-end residential cleaning company in the suburbs of Chicago. On Instagram, Kulas described himself as a yogi and a spiritual catalyst. So we hear of the fractured left. Do you feel that the right is fractured too, or did you feel that there was a kind of weird, militarized, religious coherence about the right as you saw it?
Well, because only leftists can be yogis.
Certainly, we associate, I mean, this is a bias, we associate possibly yogis in Greece, no?
Well,
Not on the capital.
I do think that the extreme right in the US right now has been very successful in kind of creating a cultural appeal of anti-establishment as being the really the team to be on if you're anti-establishment, however you define that. And that has attracted a certain number of confused young people to their cause. But you know, like that guy and a lot of the people that were in the Capitol, I don't think that they're very clear in their own heads about their ideologies and how they tracked with, you know, American politics. He probably doesn't even vote. I mean, yogis don't vote, do they?
But again, at the core of this, do you feel that there's something more? There's something that's holding more than possibly on the left.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, it's true that I reported on the anti-fascist movement in Portland, and it's true that like those young people have assessed that the United States is irredeemably corrupt to its core, and it's designed to oppress certain categories of Americans, and therefore, you know, no amount of reform can fix it, and the only solution is to tear it all down and build something new. They're true revolutionaries in that sense, but they're not at all representative of the left in the US by any means. I mean, they hate Joe Biden as much as they hate Trump. And they certainly don't identify as, you know, Democrats. Whereas on the right, this has become, you know, the entire party's platform is tearing it all down. So that it's important to make that you can't, you know, it's important to make that distinction and not fall into the trap of false equivalence between like Antifa and Trumpism, because one has entirely co-opted, you know, the political machine of their side of the spectrum, and the other is still just extremely marginal and explicitly condemned by mainstream, you know, liberal politicians.
I just want to get you on this, since we have a room full of people. What was so haunting about the opening of Storm is Here is you write at the end of your introduction, towards the end of your introduction, January 6th was not the apotheosis of the evolution. It was another stage. The evolution is ongoing. Do you feel there's more to come?
Oh, no doubt. Yeah, I mean, I feel more confident about that sentence now than I do when I wrote it. Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, you have, yeah, the notion that, you know, Republicans in the US are gonna just accept future elections that they lose, I think is a dangerous kind of illusion that, yeah, we might be comforting ourselves with.
I think one of the really effective things you do in that book is you present these images from Syria, from Afghanistan, as kind of specters of what conflict really means, you know, what it can come to, the way that society can come unraveled, and the devastation that it inflicts.
And not for nothing, but the people on both the left and the right who are advocating, you know, for revolution are people who have no idea what that actually looks like.
Thank you.
Like, and that's again, like, you know, read Matt's reporting from the fall of Kabul last summer.
Thank you. Can we have a big round of applause, please, for Matt and Lou? Thank you. Thank you. So now we have time for we started late, so we'll run over, and you're all safe for the reception anyway, so time is flew.
Anyone have any questions in the audience? Yes, I just saw one hand shoot up.
Hi, thank you for your presentation, because it's obviously something that I've not been, you know, party to in my life generally. But the question I have is that now, like we have a situation in Iran where journalism is not being allowed, and yet I suppose we probably have people with GoPros, and whether they can get this information out is I suppose suspect. But how would you, as journalists, approach trying to report that?
Well, let Matt maybe answer that question, but there have been amazing videos coming out of Iran of protests, and particularly young women. On Twitter, you got to go on Twitter to see them. Yeah. Oh, on Instagram, what's that? Sorry.
So it's on, they have something called stories. So yeah, there, I mean, we've seen these incredible, stunning, very moving images of, young women, classroom of schoolgirls chasing out their principal, incredible images of bravery and defiance. I think that the role that journalism could play in this case, I mean, I'm thinking of not a plug for my colleagues, but the Visual Investigations did a piece recently. I think it ran yesterday. Yeah. My friend Nilo Tabrizi and Haley Willis, they kind of like you provide context and you provide explanations and you help people make sense of this torrent of videos, and also you verify them. You can use techniques like looking at the buildings that are in the background and matching them with satellite images to say, yes, this video was taken precisely here on this date. And so you help to cut through the misinformation, because there's a lot of false images that circulate. Also, there's a lot of deliberate disinformation as well. But they, in this piece, not only did that, but they kind of highlighted some important themes and like defiance towards traditional symbols of authority, of course, women in the lead. And I think it's a really great example if you want to check out that piece in the New York Times yesterday.
Any other questions in the room? Don't be shy. Yes. I saw hands go up and then go down.
Sometimes, particularly in the Times, I read the comments. I'm sort of a comment junkie. And sometimes you find out, well, you think you find out more information, complementary information to what the journalist has told you. And sometimes, for instance, in comments on a piece that was in the Times, I don't know if it was today or yesterday, a small piece about Ukraine sort of on the edge of the conflict. As you say, not about the front lines, but anyway, some commenters were alluding to missteps, let's call them, of Ukraine's past. And I was wondering, how you evaluate, or whether you think it's important to refer to those and so on.
Well, every article is a balancing act, and you have a limited number of words, in which to communicate your what you've witnessed. And so, sometimes it's a discussion that you have with your editor as well, and with yourself, how much weight to give certain historical context, and when is it distracting from much more urgent information, and when does it inappropriately eclipse something that or more pressing priorities. But yeah, of course, you always leave stuff out, not just historical context, but even things that you've reported firsthand. That's just part of the writing process, and one that's also fraught, admittedly, with other ethical conundrums, and it's an imperfect art. It's not a science, especially our kind of literary long form journalism.
I read the comments too sometimes. They're kind of like the id of your readers. You know, they express a lot of things. And often it's not pretty, but it's always interesting, educated.
The New Yorker
The
website
comments are
doesn't have
things
it.
that go on under the article when it's online on the internet.
I
on the
thought they were
computer.
printed in the back of the magazine.
Exactly.
I read the
Wait.
letters to the editor.
Do we have other questions in the room? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you both. It's been a very rich discussion. I was curious kind of on the more personal side. Sebastian Younger writes about coming home from war reporting and produced a couple of documentaries on the subject as well. What's your relationship to, I guess, meaning in your profession and then also the society you return to from assignment? Thank you.
Well, he's going to Ukraine on Friday.
Yeah.
I'm going to Afghanistan in a few weeks, so I guess that's your answer.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, do you mean like how and how you leverage your experiences to the benefit of your own country as a citizen, or more personally, like
But he writes about quitting as well, like he had to stop because it was destroying him and his relationships.
Yeah. Well, I think that as soon as you notice yourself descending into that kind of I don't know, self-absorption, you should quit, because you know, at the end of the day, it's like, it's not about having experiences. It's not about having adventures. You're not doing this. You shouldn't be you know, going to these places and inserting yourself into other people's lives in moments of extremis and crisis out of some personal motivation or psychological emotional motivation. And I think that, yeah, it's just, for me anyway, it's important never to lose sight of that, and never, and as long as you're focused on doing your subjects justice, I find that in itself is you know, I won't say therapeutic, but it keeps any kind of indulgence of, you know, personal issues at bay, for now anyway.
I have a quick answer for you. Do you know the work of Karl Malantes? Okay, you should check out. He was just in Paris. He was here for Festival America, and I interviewed him. So I read his fiction and some of his nonfiction. He wrote this book called What It's Like to Go to War. And at the end, he describes precisely this experience. I mean, he was fighting in the Vietnam War, and then he came home and wrote 2 enormous books of fiction about them, about this experience. And this is a book of nonfiction, but he describes this boundary between kind of the transcendence and the sublime of the battlefield and then coming home to the mundane. And he says for him and for future soldiers that literature will be very instrumental, whether you're writing it or reading it. And I think it's a testament to both of their work as writers. So check out that book.
We've got time for one last question, and we do have one on Zoom, which I might turn to. So Gabriel, who is sending his greetings from Brazil, wants to know if you have any advice for young reporters who are seeking to do freelance work overseas and don't have the support of big news organizations that can kind of get him there.
It's tough. It's really tough. And it obviously it depends on what country you're in. But I mean, I think probably that the most useful thing would be to have a conversation with him about his particular circumstances. So I'd be happy to give him my email.
Well, hopefully
Yeah.
things in Brazil won't
And-
go to a direction where he's going to have plenty of opportunities at home.
Yeah.
But we were talking about this the other day, that in some ways, I mean, there's a lot more attention on journalists and their trauma, journalists and their safety. that didn't exist when we got started. You could just go and be
Yeah.
a freelancer in a war zone and editors would take your pieces. Now they won't at all. You have to be part of their corporatized security program. There's security advisors have become very much part of it.
Yeah.
And as of insurance companies. And it's kind of, I wonder how much, it must have been a lot more difficult, I think, for young freelancers to get their start, because it does mean taking risks, and there's no risk-free way to cover war, and not from the front lines. And so that's not advice, but I do think that, you have to find ways to, it's not necessarily a good idea to jump in the deep end. So you have to find ways to increase your proximity, move somewhere, learn the language, build contacts so that you have the ability to operate more safely in these kind of situations.
Yeah. No, but what Matt is saying is exactly right. There's a problem in the industry now, in which the publications, because of litigation reasons, liability reasons, are so risk averse that they won't even consider pitches from freelancers in war zones, because they don't want to incentivize freelancers going there in the first place. And that started in Syria when a lot of people were dying. And it's gotten increasingly worse since then. Yeah.